I still see a few people just coming in through the waiting room.
That's fine.
So we'll just give it a minute. Okay, I think we can get started with our kind of opening business here. Good morning, everyone. I wanted to thank you all for joining us for our history talk on the 75th anniversary of VE Day. Our talk is at the end, the beginning, how Canadians experienced the Second World War and the lessons for today, presented by Dr. Graham Broad. Before I introduce Dr. Broad, I wanted to just address a few housekeeping matters. I would ask that you stop video if possible. This will just allow us to have a smoother, more crisp presentation if we don't have different videos streaming throughout the presentation. You are all muted, but if you have questions, Dr. Broad will answer them at the end if you wanted to put your questions into the chat box. When you are in the chat box, you will notice there are a number of options for people you can address your question to. Make sure you select Dr. Graham Broad. I also wanted to advise you that the session is being recorded, so we can share it again later. And just thank you all for attending. Welcome to our alumni, our students, prospective students, members of the King's community, and the community at large. We're glad you could all join us today. In terms of event format, we'll have our presentation presented by Dr. Broad, followed by questions at the end. And our event will go for approximately 1 hour. Graham Broad is Associate Professor of History at King's and the co-director of the Digital History Project, Wartime Canada, and a field guide for the Canadian Battlefields Foundation. He is the author of A Small Price to Pay, Consumer Culture on Canada's Home Front, 1939 to 1945, One in a Thousand, The Life and Death of Eddie MacKay, Royal Flying Corps, and the forthcoming As If a Part of Life Itself, The War Diary of Leslie Miller, CEF. In April, he received the 2020 King's Award for Excellence in Full-Time Teaching. I wanted to thank you very much, Dr. Broad, for presenting today, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Although we're not physically located at King's University College today, I thought it would be very important that we begin today by acknowledging that King's is situated on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenapehoik, and the Attawandaron people. And our land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples who we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors to our society. And on today especially, I think we should also acknowledge that Canada's Indigenous people were vital contributors to Allied victory in both the First and Second World War. Well, thanks once again, Katrina. Thank you all for being here. From what I heard, we have close to 130 people participating, or people were signed up for today. That speaks to the vibrancy of the King's University College community. Always a pleasure to speak to the alumni. Today's event brings to mind an event we did about 3 years ago on a much sunnier and warmer summer day when we went to Niagara-on-the-Lake to do a War of 1812 battlefield tour. And it's my hope that we'll be able to do an in-person event like that again sometime before too long. I'd like to welcome our many other visitors as well. We have prospective students and their parents. Welcome. Many friends and colleagues are attending. I'm delighted to see as well that this talk is actually being attended by some academic colleagues of mine who I know only from Twitter. And much as we complain about social media, recent events have demonstrated, I think, what a powerful tool social media can be for bringing us together. Now, the advertised title of today's talk promised some lessons from the home front experience that we might apply to the circumstances that we find ourselves in today. But I'm actually going to urge extreme caution about that. When we talk about lessons of history, we have to be very careful. We don't want to draw exact parallels between Canada and wartime and the circumstances that we find ourselves in today. And we should probably resist the overuse of war metaphors. But there is a case to be made, I think, for considering how Canada's government and its people responded in a time of crisis that bears some similarities to our circumstances today. Then, as now, people dealt with the anxiety of separation, they dealt with economic upheaval, and they dealt with the daily specter of mass death. Well, today, of course, is the 75th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day. VE Day itself was meant to be a commemorative day marking the unconditional surrender the day before of Germany's armed forces. This brought to a close the most destructive war in the history of Europe, nearly 6 years after it had begun. It also marked a remarkable reversal of fortune. Just 3 years earlier, nearly all of Europe had been in Hitler's grasp, and the outcome of the war seemed to hang in the balance. For Canadians, this was a momentous event. It was met by huge celebrations. In fact, in Halifax, it was met by a riot in the street, such as the huge celebration you see in this fantastic picture taken in Toronto 75 years ago today. That is Bay Street in Toronto. None of these people could be sure, of course, how many months of war with Japan lay ahead. But for Canadians, the most important phase of the war was over. And they could look back on their country's service in the Allied cause with great pride, with a sense that Canadians had contributed to the war and to the victory over Nazi Germany on a scale out of all proportion to the size of the country's population. The Royal Canadian Navy, you see an exemplar bottom left there, which had begun the war with barely a dozen warships, concluded it with nearly 400 ocean-going warships, and was responsible for the escort of the great majority of North Atlantic convoys in the last 2 years of the war. The Royal Canadian Air Force, which had begun the war with barely 50 aircraft, concluded it with nearly 50 squadrons of aircraft overseas alone. And that's in addition to dozens of squadrons stationed in Canada for training for home defense, sea lane patrol, and coastal patrol. The Canadian Army, of course, built upon the very proud tradition of the Canadian Corps of the First World War. And the Canadian Army in World War II underwent what was possibly the biggest proportional expansion of any army in the world, expanding from barely 4,000 officers and men with just 2 tanks in 1939 to a peak size of 500,000 and 2 armored divisions by the end of the war. And it is no exaggeration, it is not nationalistic hyperbole to say that by war's end, having fought their way through Normandy, up the northwest, throughout Italy, and indeed liberated the Netherlands, that the Canadians were crack troops by the end of the war. But the price of victory had been very heavy. 45,000 Canadians were killed in the Second World War. This was an enormous loss of life for a country of just 12 million people. And as we commemorate victory, I think we mustn't forget that for tens of thousands of Canadians in 1945, the dominant emotion after the war was not celebration, but was one of mourning. And so across the country, to First World War cenotaphs that stood in nearly every town or city square, to the rolls of honor that dotted the walls of public buildings across the country, Canadians added the names of the fallen and the dates of the Second World War. As you can see here in Ottawa's National War Memorial, itself unveiled just on the eve of the Second World War in the summer of 1939 by the King and Queen when they visited Canada. You can see how they added the dates 39 to 45 on the side of it. And unfortunately, we've also had to add the dates of further wars, as you see in this photo as well. Adding to the sense of mourning, the sense of loss, the pain of separation was the fact that of Canada's nearly 110,000 war dead from the two world wars, all but 16,000 were buried overseas, nearly half of them in France. It was for this reason that that local war memorial, that local cenotaph, the name itself means empty tomb, became so very important in communities across Canada. The cenotaph was a surrogate grave. The annual Remembrance Day services were surrogate funerals to remember the fallen and to impart meaning upon their deaths. This photo that you see here, I took at Benny-sur-Mer Cemetery in Normandy, one of hundreds of Commonwealth War Grave Commission cemeteries in Europe at which Canadians are buried from the two world wars. And Benny is particularly notable as the final resting place for many Canadians who died on D-Day or in the first half of the Battle of Normandy. I was supposed to be there today. I was supposed to be there at Benny at Juno Beach with our friends at the Juno Beach Center and with students from King's in a course that I was co-teaching with a brilliant colleague, Professor Katrina Pascherbach. I was supposed to be there doing all that today. And I should note additionally, salt in the wounds. It's 20 degrees and sunny in Creusot-sur-Mer right now on the English Channel coast. Well, the pandemic pulled the carpet out from under all of that, didn't it? From under 2 years of course planning. COVID-19 has disrupted all of our lives in unexpected ways, from small things, trivial things, the cancellation of birthday parties, the cancellation of trips, to more serious things, the closure of businesses and economic disruption, the loss of jobs, and of course, for some, sudden and unexpected deaths of loved ones. And that's precisely the sort of impact that the war had upon Canadians 2 generations ago. And indeed, for millions of people around the world, their lives were disrupted, in some cases in comparatively small ways, but of course for others traumatically and tragically. And so it's probably not surprising that we see all around us examples of people reaching for war metaphors. Our memory of the war becomes a lens through which we try to understand what's happening to us now. Our Prime Minister did it. In his Easter message to Canadians, Prime Minister Trudeau, well, he himself was in quarantine, of course, because Sophie Gregory Trudeau had contracted COVID. He said, remembering Easter Monday of 1917, when the Canadians stormed Vimy Ridge, we're going through a tough time, but we've been through tough times before. And he went on to reflect on Canadian suffering and sacrifices at Vimy, stating that their bravery and courage lives on today in our nurses, doctors, paramedics, custodial workers, truckers, cashiers, and frontline workers. And notice that word frontline, right? The metaphors of war being used to describe our circumstances today. And it's not just politicians, everybody's doing this. This article appeared in the Globe and Mail this morning, To Endure Our Long Fight, Look to Canadian Spirit in the Second World War, by my great friend, to a friend of many of us listening today, Dr. Tim Cook, a historian at the Canadian War Museum and probably the foremost Canadian historian of his generation, wrote a column on this very theme in the Globe this morning that I commend to your attention. Journalists and political cartoonists are doing it. Here we have the iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter, now remade over by an American political cartoonist into Rosie the Registered Nurse. The Toronto Public Library got really creative and took some Second and First World War propaganda posters and updated them with more contemporary COVID-19 messages. So here on the left, we see a propaganda poster from the Second World War, which was urging conservation and thrift. If you don't need it, don't buy it. Updated to the modern message, if you don't need it, don't buy it. And of course, it's toilet paper that they're talking about. This next one, also by the Toronto Public Library, I quite like. This is a First World War recruitment poster. Your chums are fighting, why aren't you? They changed it to, your chums are baking, why aren't you? And even just regular people handed a megaphone by social media have been reaching for historical analogies upon which to grind their particular axes. For example, these two guys on Twitter, I just grabbed them at random this morning, are using the memory of their country's respective military achievements to argue against the lockdown. We didn't take Omaha Beach by staying at home. The guy underneath says the same thing, we didn't take Juno Beach by staying at home. Whereas these two people are using the memory of Omaha Beach and Vimy Ridge to argue for the lockdown. Previous generations stormed those beaches. We can stay at home. Well, I think we have to be careful. I would argue that we should resist imparting contemporary political and social views onto the motivations of generations past. They aren't us. They had their own motivations for going to war. They didn't fight for our society. They fought for our own. But having said that, the fact is that none of this is new. During the war itself, people drew upon historical analogies of national achievement or struggle in an effort to compel what we might call patriotic correctness. So here you see two ads for victory bonds from Canada in the Second World War. Victory bonds were bonds that the government sold to the Canadian public to help offset the enormous cost of the war. They ultimately paid for about half the cost of the war this way. Now notice how the ad on the left, which appeared in 1943, refers to an event from only 1 year before, the ill-fated Canadian raid on Dieppe in August of 1942. Notice the soldier staring straight out at the reader. What were you doing while I was at Dieppe, using the power of guilt, right, to induce war savings? Whereas the ad on the right talks generally about the suffering of civilians overseas, suggesting that the hardships being endured by Canadians in wartime were comparatively small ones, and perhaps people should just stop complaining. And that particular claim that people have gotten soft, that they're unwilling to endure hardship, is one that we hear all the time today, isn't it? And it's leveled in particular at young people, right? Millennials, Generation Z, snowflakes. But of course, this is the oldest trick in the book. It's probably the case that every generation in history has been chastised by the one that came before it for being lazy and indolent and immoral. Nonetheless, it's probably surprising to find that this exact accusation was leveled at our own greatest generation too. Consider, for example, the very popular American newspaper columnist, liberal anti-fascist writer Dorothy Thompson, whose columns were very widely carried in the Canadian press and who spoke in Canada often during the Second World War. There she is speaking to a large crowd in Winnipeg shortly after the United States declared war. She's there in February of 1942. Thompson had just written a column in which she made the following argument. We're losing the war to the Axis. Why are we losing the war? We're losing the war because consumer culture, mass society has made Britons, Americans, and Canadians soft. They've only ever known the comfort of consumer society. An incredible claim that she's making that in 1942, a time when half of farms didn't have electricity yet, when most Canadians didn't have electric refrigerators and so on. But she was making this claim in 1942. She said the world is being given a shellacking by a handful of Japanese soldiers who live on handfuls of rice, by exactly that generation of Germans who were undernourished in their childhood. And what's lacking, in her view, was a willingness to sacrifice on the part of pampered individuals and governments willing and necessary to impose the necessary hardships. Arguments very similar to those that we see today. Well, nobody thought more about these issues than this guy. This is William Lyon Mackenzie King, Prime Minister of Canada. You can see him here on Victory in Europe Day, 1945, about to deliver his Victory in Europe speech. And I hope you can see that speech. I've read that speech. It's as long as it looks. That's what politicians did back then. They gave speeches that lasted for an hour or more, as opposed to rage tweeting on Twitter. In 1939, Mackenzie King had already been Prime Minister of Canada for 14 years, for most of the 1920s and for the last half of the 1930s. He was an intellectual, 4 university degrees, including a PhD in political economy from Harvard. He was rather dour and introspective, a largely friendless individual. It was later discovered he was privately a practicing spiritualist who conducted seances and for whom every terrestrial event held some kind of supernatural significance. He had 3 dogs, all of them Irish Terriers, and he named all of them Pat. He was personally unpopular with the Canadian people, but he kept winning elections. He had extraordinarily political acumen and an intuition for the pulse of the Canadian people. And I think this in turn explains his unrivaled achievement anywhere in the British Commonwealth of serving a total of 22 years as Prime Minister. He was also a very unlikely wartime leader because he was a completely unmilitary man who was suspicious of professional soldiers and who loathed and detested violence. And yet, he did as much to impart his own character on Canada's war effort as Churchill and Roosevelt did upon theirs. Now, you can't be prime minister at all without making enemies. King was prime minister for 22 years. He had a lot of enemies, he had a lot of critics. And his critics tended to accuse him of being wishy-washy and indecisive. When he died, the poet F.R. Scott wrote the following words about him, scathing words. "Let us raise up a temple to the cult of mediocrity. Do nothing by halves which can be done by quarters." That's the way a lot of people thought about King, that he was indecisive. I would say that he was actually highly decisive in his indecisiveness. He once said, famously, not necessarily conscription, but conscription if necessary. That's the type of position that King always carved out. He had mastered the art of compromise. He knew that compromise by definition means everybody gets less than what they want. And King instinctively understood that it was the only way to govern a country that was as fractious and divided as Canada. Now, you might think in wartime or in a time of crisis, the only correct position to take would be one of no compromise, that all restraint had to be immediately set aside on behalf of a total war effort. But King was very mindful of the lessons learned in the previous war, in the First World War. That the economic hardship of war, there had been runaway inflation in Canada during the First World War. That the crisis over conscription, that is involuntary military service, had nearly torn Canada apart, particularly between French and English Canadians. There were violent riots in Quebec in over Easter in 1918. He was very mindful of these events and wished to avoid their repetition in the Second World War. And so he promised Canadians what historians have referred to as a war of limited liability. And what was meant by that is that Canada would do all it could to aid the Allies to win the war, but it would do so in a way that was mindful of the needs of Canadians at home. So King promised that only volunteers would serve overseas, and that the country's main contributions to war would be economic and material rather than fighting forces. Now, as events would have it, Canada ended up mounting a massive military effort overseas alongside its huge economic contributions to Allied victory. And King did have to bend a bit on his promise about conscription. They never passed conscription legislation per se, but there was a one-time levy of men already raised for home front service late in the war to serve overseas. But he managed to hold the country together, and the standard of living remained high enough so as not to imperil the war effort. And it's mainly the home front that I want to talk about today in my remaining time. I want to give you some examples of the things that I'm talking about here. King had been a leading figure in the 1920s in securing full independence for Canada on the world stage. Canada attained full legislative autonomy in December of 1931. He understood better than anyone that it was possible to serve the interests of Canada's allies and Canada's own domestic interests simultaneously. And a very good example of this would be this program, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which was a vast pilot training program that was arguably Canada's single most significant economic contribution to the Allied war effort. Now, the idea of training pilots, British and Commonwealth pilots in Canada during the war had been percolating throughout the 30s, and there was actually precedent for it because they trained pilots here in the First World War. There were a lot of advantages to training pilots here because of our wide open spaces that were secure from enemy air attack. But negotiations to get the plan underway were highly acrimonious because, while the British wanted Canada to pay for the plan, and it was very expensive, and the Canadians agreed to that, the British also wanted to run the plan. This didn't sit well with King and the Canadians, who insisted and who eventually succeeded in convincing the British that the plan would be administered in Canada by Canadians. Now, the air training plan saw pilots trained in various constituent parts of the Commonwealth, New Zealand, Australia, Rhodesia, Bermuda, but the majority of them were trained in Canada. In fact, by the time the plan ceased operations in 1945, nearly 132,000 pilots and aircrew had received some or all of their training in Canada at places such as you see here, pilots at what was called Little Norway. We also trained Free Norwegian forces That's now Toronto Island. The flight school in Verdun, Manitoba. Below, bottom left, you can see the North American Harvard trainer, a great many of which are still flying, thousands of which were manufactured in Canada during the wars. So 132,000 pilots and aircrew at over 150 training schools that were built across the country. In fact, the plan was so successful that by late 1943, it was turning out pilots faster than operational squadrons could absorb them, and they had to slow down the training. Now, most of the cost of this program, which cost billions of dollars, was absorbed by the Canadian government, even though half of the pilots trained were British. And some critics accused Mackenzie King of giving away the farm. But King knew that the plan not only benefited the Canadian war effort and Canada's allies, it had a huge economic spin-off effect at home. It employed over 100,000 civilians on the bases, 151 training schools. It required the manufacture of over 10,000 training aircraft at home, with further spin-offs and job creation. It laid the basis for post-war civil aviation in this country by leaving the country with a hugely expanded system of airfields across the country. And this is to say nothing of the economic benefit to many small towns across the country who benefited by having thousands of airmen stationed nearby. So King understood it was nonsensical to think in terms of Canada first. Rather, it was a matter of Canada serving its own interests and those of the Allies simultaneously. And we see this in a lot of ways. For example, we see it in the entire case of war production generally. During the war, the false binary of public versus private sector was put aside, and very close relations between government, industry, and labor were formed. Another interesting thing about Mackenzie King was he knew his limits, and so he recruited very talented ministers. He listened to expert counsel, which is something we need in leaders. And one of those people was the guy on the left there in the top hat. That's C.D. Howe, the very formidable and talented Minister of Munitions and Supply, which was a department in charge of, well, munitions and supply. And Howe, in turn, recruited top business and labor leaders to help guide war production in Canada. And Canada, during the Second World War, ultimately turned out more war material than all other parts of the Commonwealth outside of Britain put together. About 70% of Canadian military production in the Second World War, including these Valentine tanks that you see Howe inspecting here in 1941, were exported to Allied countries, particularly the Commonwealth countries, because Canadian war production was at a level that was so great it hugely exceeded the needs of Canada's own armed forces, even though they were growing in size. So, for example, about half of the British Army's wheeled vehicles in the Second World War were supplied by Canadian sources. And moreover, the great majority of the cost of all this was essentially written off by the Canadian government in the form of gifts and grants to the UK and through Canada's equivalent of the American Lend-Lease program. Lend-Lease was a program by which the United States provided free military aid essentially to the Allies or extended loans. The Canadian equivalent, which was actually bigger in proportional terms, was called mutual aid. Like so-called foreign aid today, it wasn't always popular with Canadians at home that we were giving away billions of dollars to Allied countries. But like aid today, it was often poorly understood. It was not only necessary for the war effort. King understood the front line there is the front line here, but it was tied to a huge economic boom in Canada as war plants put hundreds of thousands of people to work, including, it should be noted, hundreds of thousands of Canadian women who had rarely worked in heavy industrial manufacturing before. And just as an aside, I want to show you something interesting. You're all familiar with this, of course. This is the iconic American figure, Rosie the Riveter. You're also familiar with the image I showed you earlier of her flexing her muscles. This is the version of Rosie the Riveter that appeared on the Saturday Evening Post in a famous illustration by Norman Rockwell in 1943. And you can see she's got a rivet gun, a ham sandwich, and she's crushing Mein Kampf underfoot. Most people don't realize this is actually, Rockwell borrowed this from Michelangelo's painting of Saint Isaiah on the Sistine Chapel wall. So you can see Isaiah there has a book, Rosie has a rivet gun, Isaiah has an open hand, Rosie has a ham sandwich. Isaiah's feet are crossed, Rosie's feet are crossed on Hitler's book, Mein Kampf. It's quite clever. Well, Canada had its own equivalent of Rosie the Riveter, We had Ronnie, the Bren Gun Girl. There she is, Ronnie, the Bren Gun Girl, who in 1941 did a series of propaganda ads, photographer unknown, but there are these remarkably salacious and risque images of her stroking the barrel of a Bren gun that she's manufactured. Another thing that Mackenzie King understood well was the importance of Canada-US relations, and this is something that prime ministers before him had often been reticent about. And it's very fortunately, Canada's longest serving prime minister had quite good relations with the Americans' longest serving president. FDR was a very affable gentleman. And he and Mackenzie King got along quite well. In fact, they got along better than Mackenzie King did with Winston Churchill. It's often said that during the war, Canada left the British orbit and entered an American one, but it's not quite as simple as that. So just quickly, this picture, and by the way, this is a real color photograph. Hasn't been subsequently colorized. This is the Quebec Conference of August 1943, an important summit meeting between Allied leaders and their chiefs of staff, which occurred at the Citadel and Chateau Laurier in Quebec. There you can see Mackenzie King top left. Winston Churchill, looking his most gangster, top right. FDR seated, always seated. He was wheelchair bound, of course, with the wheelchair, given the prejudices of the time, almost never appearing in photographs. And the gentleman bottom right is the Earl of Athlone, who was a member of the British royal family, who was the Governor General of Canada. So Canada-US relations during the war, what we can say is this. Through a series of economic and mutual defense agreements during the war, the Canadian wartime economies and militaries began to work almost as one unit. Canadian and American supply, including the food supply, would eventually be treated as one stockpile and allocated according to priority. Nothing about this system worked perfectly. There was acrimony, there were always disagreements. But it's also the case that both sides were capable of showing enormous generosity. So for example, the United States let the British buy war materials in Canada and bill it to the United States on their Lend-Lease account. It helped to have a very generous figure, a very responsible and reasonable figure as President of the United States. Canada also acted as host country for important wartime summits, including two conferences at Quebec City. In the first one that you see here, British and American generals did critical early planning for the D-Day invasion and also merged their atomic bomb programs. But King stepped aside for this conference. He knew Canada's place in the world. He stepped aside. He did not directly participate in the military discussions. Instead, he acted as host. And here's an absolutely lovely photograph of him and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. The Roosevelts also love their dog. This is Fala, the White House dog. Fala was a Scottish Terrier. Pat, King's dog, was an Irish Terrier, and Pat and Fala got to have a little summit meeting in Quebec. And so while Churchill and Roosevelt and their generals were inside discussing D-Day, Mackenzie King and Eleanor Roosevelt went for walks on the boardwalk. And he hosted dinners and receptions and the like after. Now, critics at his time alleged that this proved that King was unserious. But on the contrary, his diary, and he kept diaries almost the entirety of his adult life, and they're now available digitally and online. His diary reveals that at those receptions, on the fringes, at every moment, King was constantly advocating for Canadian interests alongside those of Allied interests. I have a chart that I just want to show you very briefly to give you an idea of the gigantic scale of Canada's war effort in the Second World War. And this is Canadian military and government spending from 1939 to 1945 in millions of dollars. So you can see in 1939 on the military, Canada spent $118 million. That number expands 40-fold by the peak in 1943. By which time the military, that's the war effort generally, was taking up about 85% of Canadian government expenditure. Now, people often ask how much money is $4.6 billion today. Inflationary calculations alone don't really capture it, but instead we might look at it this way. It's 85% of government spending in 1943 and 1944. 85% of government spending today would be like spending $230 billion on the war and on the armed forces. By comparison, we spend about $20 billion on the armed forces today. So it's a colossal sum of money. And that enormous diversion of resources to the war effort was bound to have a monumental economic impact on consumers at home. And that's what I want to talk about in my remaining 6 or 7 slides. Early in the war, with great foresight, King's government created an organization called the Wartime Prices and Trade Board. Its job was to oversee the regulation of the consumer economy. It was in charge of regulating prices and make sure that things like price gouging didn't occur. Later it would be in charge of rationing. And the board in turn created what was called the consumer branch. The consumer branch was to act as a liaison with the country's housewives, because it was understood that Canadian wives and mothers were responsible for the great majority of shopping in the country. Now, by late 1941, because of that diversion of resources to the war effort, staple goods had begun to disappear from the shelves. Shelves in stores began to show bare spots, something we're familiar with now. There was a narrower range of goods available, and this was exacerbated as the war went on, and retailers had to change the way they did business. They had fewer staff, so there was a greater move towards customer service. It had used to be the case that in the 30s and before, people would go to stores with a grocery list, which they would hand to a stock boy, and the stock boy would go get the groceries for them. Not anymore. Now a pivot towards greater self-service, which is something, of course, that continued after the war. Stores were required to have shorter business hours, and that made it harder for people to get out and shop and perform after work, something we're familiar with too. And something anybody who works in retail is familiar with. Retailers had to put up with angry customers who were incensed about shortages and the like. And some businesses had to close altogether because the products they sold, radios, cars, appliances, these things were simply not available after 1941. Or in some cases, they shifted to providing service and maintenance to try to make it through for the duration. Here's a case where if someone had asked me 6 months ago, I would have told them that yes, there will be shortages, there will be a run on certain goods. I just never would have predicted it was going to be toilet paper. What went short in the Second World War? Well, goods like coffee, tea, and sugar were imported to Canada, so there was a reduced supply of them. In other cases, butter and meat, there were huge shortages of by 1942, even though butter and meat production skyrocketed in Canada during the war. So why were there shortages? There were shortages because of panic buying. People heard through the grapevine that people were hoarding butter and meat because they were worried there would be short stockpiles, shortages. And so this led to a snowball effect. People heard about others hoarding, so they began to hoard themselves. And it was that, not shortages of supply or production, but panic buying that resulted in the actual shortages. So at first, as you see here in the photograph on the left from 1941, the government asked for voluntary rationing. And this, I think, is an important lesson. When voluntary rationing, when voluntarism failed, and it was a national defense issue, the government legislated. And in April of 1942, the government began to create a program of coupon rationing for a variety of staple goods and gasoline that were in short supply. They registered nearly the entire country in a matter of days in early 1942, and they distributed ration books to virtually everyone in the country. And you can see on the right here a ration book from the Wartime Canada website, of which I'm co-director with Jonathan Vance. Everyone was issued a ration book. You can see here the butter and meat coupons. The way it worked was you showed your butter or meat coupon to your local grocer, and then they were allowed to sell you a portion of the good. Now, you still had to pay for it, but the system worked surprisingly well in preventing hoarding, in preventing panic buying, in preventing price gouging. There were incidents of cheating. People traded ration cards. You weren't supposed to do that. They raffled them off. They bought, sold them, counterfeited them in some cases. All that was illegal. But generally speaking, there was widespread compliance with the rationing system, and it was not necessarily unpopular. It was socially leveling. It prevented hoarding. And some consumers even wanted it to end or to continue after the war ended, which we should be reminded it did in the UK, and Canada largely wrapped up after the war. Now, alongside the rationing regime, the government of Canada produced an incessant stream of propaganda urging conservation and thrift, urging consumers to stop non-essential shopping in favor of the purchase of victory bonds. And here you can see two wartime propaganda posters that I quite like. The one on the left, the disembodied visage of Adolf Hitler whispering into the ear of a woman and saying, go on, spend it, what's the difference? You may be familiar with a famous American ad from the Second World War that said, when you drive alone, you drive with Hitler. This ad essentially says, when you shop alone, you're shopping with Hitler, or maybe you're shopping for Hitler. And you'll notice it says, Canadians, the time has come when every nickel, dime, and quarter you spend needlessly is money you spend in the cause of our enemies. On the right, another ad I quite like, Strange Things Go Into Tanks. This again, a war bonds poster. You have here a family indicating what it is that they've given up on behalf of the war effort. The father is fishing tackle, his wife, the new rug. The daughter has given up her new dress, and the boy has given up his roller skates on behalf of the war effort. But notice they're smiling, they're happy about this because they know it's being done in pursuit of a great cause, and things will eventually return to normal. Now, just as companies today are beginning to pivot in their marketing strategies to adapt to economic dislocation, so too did they do this during the Second World War. The government urged non-essential spending to stop, but the big argument was over the question of what is essential. So for example, people argued, is alcohol sales essential? Maybe the liquor store should be closed down. An argument that we're hearing precisely today, right? Well, in the world of marketing and advertising, literally everything was essential. Literally everything that remained for sale could be marketed in some fashion, not just for consumers, but as an actual contribution to the war effort. So here's a product we all wish we could get our hands on right now, Lysol. During the Second World War, encouraged housewives to enlist for the war on germs. It says the housewife plays a vital role in national defense. How? By keeping her home clean, by killing germs and keeping her family healthy for the war effort. Here we have a hand cream saying hand cream's not non-essential. In fact, you need hand cream more than ever. Why? Because you're a war worker. And so you have to have protected hands, but you're also going on dates with handsome soldiers. So you need your hands to be lovely. And my very favorite wartime ad of all, the Kellogg's company. Here we have two factory workers. They're in war industries, they're working on a machine tool. One of them says to the other, buck up, Bill, there's a war to be won. And Bill replies, 2 wars, Jack, the big one, and my private bout with constipation. And so there's a solution, of course. You know, constipation's keeping you from helping to fight the Germans. The solution is Kellogg's All Brand. By the way, I really had to go through the ringer to get Kellogg's permission to publish that ad in my last book. For some reason, their marketing people weren't too keen on it today. Well, this is food and Lysol and hand cream. Those seem like minor things, but like I said, they could market almost anything in wartime. Jewelry, for example, they argued was essential to the war effort. Here's a beautiful color ad from Maclean's magazine, December 1942, urging you to buy a jeweled watch as a gift at Christmas time to help restore those bonds of affection, even over the separation of war. And it's not clear which way the present's going, is it? Did he buy it for her out of a catalog? Or did she buy it and send it to him so that he can have a good watch overseas? It reminds me of that Monty Python sketch where they get their lieutenant a fancy clock in the middle of the Battle of the Somme. Now, companies that had nothing left to sell instead worked on name brand recognition and emphasizing their patriotic service to the war effort. So here's Ford. Ford had been completely converted to military production by 1942. And notice, here's the lineup of 1943 Fords. They're not passenger cars, they're military vehicles. And the text of the ad would sort of have you believe that they've donated these to the Canadian government. Of course, they hadn't. They're being bought like any other product. And the text of the ad goes on to say that, here's the patriotic service that Ford is rendering for the war effort. But once peace resumes, we'll be back making you the best possible cars. It should be noted, some groups at home, civic organizations, some church groups, patriotic organizations that were very much woven into the fabric of life back then, urged levels of sacrifice that were beyond those even recommended by the government. A willingness to sacrifice on behalf of the war effort was seen as a kind of patriotic litmus test, even if it went beyond what was recommended by economic experts on the home front. Now, my last few slides. As victory began to look inevitable, Canadians began to think about the future. There was a widespread sense that while the First World War had been fought to create a better world, that world had failed to materialize. What happened at the end of the First World War? A global recession, and of course, a gigantic global pandemic. And Canadians were, in common with people in all the Allied countries, eager to get it right this time. Canadians also believed that the coming of war in 1939 is what had finally ended the Great Depression. And there was widespread fear that when war production scaled down, that the Depression might resume. So business and industry promised Canadians a better future based on scientific breakthroughs. And we see an example here, a future where the technological innovation of the war would be turned to consumer account. And we see flying cars and rocket ships and healthy people living in what appear to be domed houses, domed greenhouses and the like. And on the other side, a wonderful ad that says what's coming is plenty, maybe not this year, maybe not next, but sometime we're gonna win this war, and then what's coming is plenty. Plenty of coffee, tea, bananas, butter, lard. Yes, and plenty of sanitized washable clothes. Notice how they slide the commercial pitch in there, right? All the things we had before the war started, and others we never had. Plenty of good, cheap housing, thanks to new building methods. Plenty of light, practical, inexpensive cars, cradles, and carriages, thanks to the wartime expansion of aluminum production. Plenty of cheap, fast air production, thanks to the rapid development of the aviation industry. And the government had other ideas about how to secure future prosperity. In tandem with a number of provincial governments, King's government began to take seriously something that they had largely resisted through the Great Depression, and that is a series of social welfare measures that would extend a helping hand after the wartime economy scaled down. Veterans benefits, the baby bonus, old age pensions, and employment insurance, and gradual moves towards the adoption of universal health care. Well, of course, neither of these visions came to complete fruition, of course, but some amalgam of the two did help produce an economic boom after the war. And one point I would like to stress is this. Although the generation that fought the world wars has a reputation for being our greatest generation, for being the generation that pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps, which in many respects they were, it's equally true that their most lasting legacy in Canada is that they came home from the war and they created the social welfare state. And today we have seen how all levels of government have produced, in a matter of days, massive aid projects, aid packages in response to the COVID crisis. In the Great Depression, literally years passed before even the most meager aid packages were developed. That's something that emerged out of the Second World War. There's Mackenzie King once again. And finally, I close. I think that looking to the past, and today I've just touched on a few aspects of life on the Canadian home front during the Second World War, looking at times when our country dealt with adversity, can give us not so much solutions to our present problems as perspective on them, can give us a moment of pause. Canada was successful in the Second World War because the government launched a unified global effort. The domestic economy managed and in some ways prospered because of widespread cooperation in common purpose between government, industry, and labor. And because government leaders were willing to listen to the counsel of expert opinion. Prosperity and peace was secured through a balance of the helping hand of government and the ingenuity of a regulated private sector. Nothing worked perfectly, and many people were marginalized in the process. We know that because we live in it. But it does, I think, give us hope that together we can yet have our own victory over COVID day. Thank you very much. Before I conclude, I want to do something that I always do in all of my public talks now. I want to recommend a couple of books on this topic that you might be interested in. I want to recommend the following two very recent books published on aspects of Canada during the Second World War. First by my friend and colleague, Dr. Alex Sushin, War Junk, Munitions Disposal and Post-War Reconstruction in Canada, which actually begins by looking at the late part of the Second World War. Dr. Sushin asked the question, once you've built all that stuff, what do you do with it after the war? Well, they did a lot of things with it. And in one horrifying chapter, he reveals, and I stress a horrifying chapter, he reveals that they dumped millions of tons of it, including explosives and chemicals, into the oceans. And in addition, I would strongly recommend this brand new collection by Dr. Sarah Glassford and Dr. Amy Shaw, former colleagues and former classmates. Their second volume on women and girls of Canada and Newfoundland during the World Wars. It's entitled Making the Best of It. Finally, I do wish to plug an event that's happening at 1 o'clock at King's University College today as part of our virtual open house. And that is my colleague from the Department of History, Dr. Robert Ventresca, will be talking to you about a really exciting and important new program we're launching, the Human Rights Studies module. So at 1 p.m. as part of the King's virtual open house, you can hear Dr. Ventresca talk about that. Now, at this point, I'm going to open the floor to questions. I really wish I could see you all and hear you all, but with hundreds of people, Zoom doesn't really work well that way. It's weird to be talking at a computer. I'm used to feedback. I'm used to people laughing or in some cases snoring. It does happen. But anyway, what I've got here is the access to your comments in the chat feature. And I will see what we've got. Sorry. Sorry, everyone, 1 second. These technical glitches are inevitable on with this technology. 1 second.
Graham, you may want to stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, no, I think it should be good now. I made sure that there was nothing inappropriate on my screen. Now, so what have we got here for questions? If you have questions, you can enter them into the Zoom chat at this point. Aziz, I'm having trouble getting to the Zoom group chat box, getting my mouse arrow to it. Is there a way I can hand it over to you?
Sure thing, Graham. I can read the questions out loud if I get any.
I can see that we have some people hopping off of the event now. So I just thought I would take a moment here and thank everyone for attending. Also, I'll let you know that we'll be following up with an event survey, and we'll also be distributing the recording of today's event for anyone who was unable to get in. Oh, I have a message here from someone who would like to ask a question.
Yes, please. Katrina, would it be all right if everyone sent their questions to you?
That is fine, yeah.
Yeah,
I have
if so on.
If you go to the chat function, you can choose who you want to send your question to. And so if you send it to Katrina Clark, I will read those to Professor Broad. So we have a question here from Jessica Lai. She would like to know, were there a lot of efforts to memorialize the war by the government? For instance, government projects committed to the memory of the war, and how do those early efforts affect us now?
That's an excellent question. So there were massive memorialization projects by all levels of government, municipal, provincial, and federal. In many cases, what they did for the Second World War, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, was take the pre-existing war memorials from the First World War and graft the Second World War onto them, add rules of honor, add the dates of the Second World War and its significant battles. In some cases, altogether new memorials were built, but very often they repurposed the First World War memorials. The other commemorative project, of course, that Canada was involved in was the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, then known as the Imperial War Graves Commission. The IWGC, or CWGC as it's now called, was created during the First World War to commemorate and bury the war's dead. It expanded that activity during the Second World War. And so there are Commonwealth war graves now in over 150 countries in the world. Essentially anywhere that a Commonwealth soldier during either of the world wars fell, they are buried. The CWGC buried people as near to where they fell as possible. And the Canadian government contributes still to this day to the Commonwealth War Grave Commission for the upgrade of those, or maintenance, I should say, of those graves. So those, the basic pattern of memorials was established and of commemorative events was established between the world wars and continues to down to the present day. I would suggest that someone who went to a Remembrance Day service in Canada in the 1930s would be entirely familiar with a standard Remembrance Day service today, 75 years later. Very good question.
Graham, I have several questions coming in now.
Yeah, I'm happy to stay. If people gotta go, you can go, and I'm happy to stay and answer questions as well.
Okay, so the next question is from Renee. She's wondering if you can speak a bit about people producing their own goods like butter and marketing them personally, and did the government react to that?
Yeah, so there was a huge home economy, the pre-existing home economy that ramped up during the Second World War. Of course, people had victory gardens and so on. If the people at home were producing rationed goods, farmers, for example, producing butter and meat, they were actually required by the Wartime Prices and Trade Board to turn in the equivalent number of ration cards, ration coupons, I should say, for the goods that they produce at home. So if you produce butter at home, you were supposed to only take the rationed amount and turn in your ration coupons. If you slaughtered your own livestock at home, you were only supposed to keep your rationed portion and turn in your ration coupons. I'm not sure how often farmers would have fully complied with those regulations. They would have probably seemed pointless to them. But yes, there were the government's efforts to regulate reached into every aspect of life during the war.
Next question is from Sarah. You mentioned social groups and how they impacted rationing and the thrift mindset. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, So this is something about which I mean to plug it. I wrote an entire book called A Small Price to Pay, Consumer Culture on the Canadian Home Front. Civic organizations, service clubs, church groups, these things were very much woven into the fabric of social life in Canada before the wars. Most people, most middle-class people in particular, were members of such an organization. This would include labor organizations. And those organizations performed an important service on the home front in helping to advance the government's agenda, the government's economic program on the home front. And they actually helped the government do things like police rationing regulations. They helped the government distribute information about regulations, wartime propaganda, drive victory bond sales, and so forth. I looked in my work specifically at groups that were somehow connected to consumerism. But for those of you perhaps who are students or grad students thinking about grad school, we actually need a good history of Canadian service groups. And we certainly need a good history of Canadian churches during the Second World War.
And the next question, taking into account that we are remembering wartime and in particular rationing, how do you think we will remember our COVID-19 experiences in the future? My grandmother—
I was asked—
Oh, sorry. Question goes on. My grandmother, born in 1930, has very little memory of any restrictions, though she admits it was her mother who had to deal with the lack of access to items.
Mm-hmm. I was asked precisely that question on the radio this morning. I was on CBC Radio with one of my students from the course that was canceled, and I was asked, how do you think the future will remember this? And I cautioned that historians should be careful about forecasting the future, because we're almost always wrong when we do. But one thing if I had to guess, it would be this. When we look back on the war, we see there are a lot of social divisions. You know, beneath the veneer of everyone pulling together, there are indeed social divisions, but there was still a sense of common purpose. I think today, not so much in Canada, but certainly in the United States, we see a factionalism on political issues that is leading people to make conclusions about how they should respond to COVID based not on evidence, but based on their political affiliation. So, for example, in the United States, the percentage of Republicans who think COVID is a serious problem, who agree with the shutdown, is much, much smaller than the number of Democrats. So what you have there are people choosing their social position based not on evidence, but based on political party affiliation. I think that's something that's quite distinct from what tended to happen in Canada during the Second World War, where we see much more unanimity across the political parties.
Next question is from Jeff. At the end of the war, how did Canada reintegrate the soldiers back into society?
Yeah, and so a friend of many of us, Dr. Peter Neary, retired from the University of Western Ontario. Dr. Neary wrote a wonderful book about that called On Civvy Street. It's a few years ago, and I would recommend that to your attention. Dr. Peter Neary's On Civvy Street. Essentially, there was a balance of government aid to soldiers, various acts passed to extend educational, housing benefits, unemployment benefits, etc., to return soldiers, job retraining, that type of thing, a hand up to help them make their way in the post-war world. Where they weren't good, and in part that's simply a reflection of the era in which they lived, where they weren't good was in dealing with the psychological trauma of war. Many soldiers came back from the war psychologically traumatized, and they weren't good at diagnosing it at the time, and just society as a whole was not as attuned to dealing with mental health issues. Of course, we have our own problems with that today, but they were far greater in the 1940s and 1950s. But in terms of the material aspects of things, I think the Canadian government did quite well. And one of the reasons for the gigantic expansion of universities in both Canada and the United States after the war was because so many returned servicemen were able to go to university and receive a free education.
Next question. You described the disputes concerning wartime production. To what extent did the conflicts fall on partisan lines?
Yeah, I mean, they did to a certain extent, and I don't mean to suggest that anything worked harmoniously. Nothing ever did, but it worked well enough. It was indeed an era of, there was a lot of labor agitation, for example. But having said that, there was also an extraordinary amount of accommodation of labor. There was a recognition on the government's part that cooperative relations at a time of crisis between employer and workforce was necessary. In terms of things falling along party lines, King's government had an overwhelming majority in Parliament during the Second World War. And moreover, it passed the War Measures Act, which essentially empowered them to do anything they needed to do on behalf of the war effort. And so usually where we see dissent, it would be the opposition parties arguing that the government wasn't doing enough. The government wasn't doing enough to prosecute the war effort. Late in the war, the CCF party, which later became the NDP, began to turn its attention to the post-war world and how the government would navigate that. And they proposed a whole series of social welfare measures, which Mackenzie King, in his customary style, adopted partially, and to sort of pull the carpet out from under some of the more CCF's radical proposals. So there was some dissent along party lines, yes.
This comes from Jonathan. It's interesting to see parallels in the national response then during the war with what's happening now. What also strikes me is that today's response isn't total. Companies can produce PPE, but it isn't nationalized or mandatory. Your thoughts?
Yeah, and it's interesting because there has been, both in Canada and the United States, pressure exerted on the federal government to sort of activate, in the United States case, the Defense Production Act, and in Canada, the Emergency Powers Act, which is the new version of the War Measures Act, so as essentially to nationalize and standardize that response. Neither government has felt that it's necessary to do so yet. This might be another case where in the long view of history, we judge them on that basis. But it certainly has not been the kind of total response we saw in the Second World War. Although I want to emphasize once again, King's government always found a way to moderate things, right? They always charted a middle course, helping the war effort, but at the same time, not wanting to disrupt things too far on the home front.
This question comes from Mary. Do I understand correctly that the federal government post-World War II fully funded education for veterans?
Education is largely a provincial matter in Canada. But yes, there was very substantial federal government aid and legislation passed regarding education. And actually, and maybe some of the other historians might be able to chip in here, I'm not sure if it fully funded education, but I think it did for veterans. I think it did fully fund it for veterans.
This is from Paula. Do you think the current increasing unemployment in the US and Canada will create more tension or more collaboration between the two countries based on what we know from past crises?
Wow. I underscored the fact that during the Second World War, Canada-US relations dramatically improved, and cooperation between the two countries on economic and military planning issues grew dramatically during the Second World War. I underscored that point to contrast the circumstances today. I don't want it to be overtly political in this talk, but I don't think there's any escaping the fact that the Trump administration has been quite hostile towards the Canadian government in many respects. And so cooperation across borders right now seems to be very difficult to achieve. And there's going to be a huge dispute coming up over the question of reopening, fully reopening the Canada-US border. Of course, it's still partially open, but that will be a major debate coming forward, and I suspect will receive enormous pressure from the US government to do so.
This question goes back to rations. It's from Paul. My parents spoke often of the black market. Any information on how extensive it was?
Yeah, so very good historian Jeffrey Keshen, in his book Saints, Sinners, and Soldiers, wrote extensively about the black market. I wrote about it a bit. It was pretty extensive. It acted as a kind of safety valve. People could always find somebody they knew who could get them additional amounts of rationed goods if they needed to. But it probably wasn't as big as people think. Certain goods, coffee, tea, sugar, for example, alcohol, which was occasionally provincially rationed, gasoline. We have a pretty good idea about how much of this was produced and consumed in Canada during the war because it was so closely regulated. And the consumption figures were either flat or went down in most cases, which suggests that the black market didn't have that much of an impact. Not much was going to the black market. What was more likely to happen was what was sometimes called a gray market. So the gray market was a case where you knew your local butcher well, and you could just say to him, hey, for an extra couple of bucks, could you put something aside for me? Or you knew your local grocer, for an extra couple of bucks, could you put something aside for me before somebody else comes and grabs it with their ration coupon? That type of thing was a lot more common. Later in the war, too, there was a more extensive black market for gasoline. And the RCMP actually sent agents undercover to drive around the gas stations to fill up their cars to see if the gas stations were properly following rationing regs. And if they weren't, they arrested people. Katrina, do we have time for a couple more?
Sorry, I had muted myself for a moment there. The next question comes from Graham. Was anti-German, anti-Japanese, anti-Italian, etc. sentiment prevalent in Canada during World War II? Were there internment camps in Canada as there were during World War I?
Yeah, so of course the Japanese Canadian population was treated appallingly during the Second World War. Essentially what happened was pre-existing racism had grafted onto it wartime security paranoia, and thousands of Japanese Canadians were incarcerated during the Second World War with no clear national defense justification. And by the way, that included some Japanese Canadians who were veterans of the First World War who fought on behalf of Canada during the First World War. Germans and Italians were not, Canadians of German and Italian ancestry were not, of whom there are a great many, were not interred. More recently arrived immigrants, however, had to register their whereabouts. They weren't allowed to own radios and that sort of thing. Anti-German sentiment is curious. There was probably a great deal more in the First World War than in the Second. There was relatively little anti-German sentiment in the Second World War because Canadians were able instead to target the Nazis, to sort of blame the Nazi leadership as opposed to the German people as a whole for the Second World War. And there seems to have been much less anti-German sentiment in World War II than in World War I. Now, as a good historian, I'd have to stress that's a provisional conclusion, but that's my sense of matters as they stand now.
Do you think it's possible that rationing could come into effect today?
Yes. Yes. I think we were almost there with toilet paper. I think we were getting close to the point of some kind of rapid form of regulation. And perhaps other staple goods. Maybe it's Lysol wipes, maybe it was hand soap, maybe it's hand sanitizer. That could come back if people panic buy. One of the clear lessons of the Second World War was that when voluntarism failed, and it's a national security issue, the government will legislate. And that will be true going forward too about climate change. If voluntarism fails, the government will legislate when it's clear it's a national defense issue. So yes, it definitely could happen.
Here's a question from Julia. Do you know how many people, or do you know how people can get records on family members in the war?
So for the First World War, all 620,000 service files for Canadians who served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force are digitally available at Library and Archives of Canada. For the Second World War, the files for those who died during the war are digitally available. You need an Ancestry.ca account. So the Library and Archives of Canada cash-strapped, essentially let Ancestry scan those files for them. And now Ancestry has access to them. For Second World War veterans who died after the war, it's much more complicated to get them, or for ones who are still alive, it's much more complicated to get them because there are still privacy restrictions in place. Some of the people are still alive or only recently passed away. But if you go to Library and Archives of Canada's website, they'll have instructions about how to order those. Note that the current turnaround time, the current time to get World War II files is a year. There's so much demand for them right now as that generation is passing into history. And if you wish to email me after, I can help you navigate those files. Katrina, do we have time for maybe one more? I'm not sure how many questions you have.
I have a comment here, and then that is it. No more questions. The comment comes from Sarah regarding Japanese internment. There is a great MA thesis by Letitia Johnson at U Saskatchewan, and also a great MA thesis on German POWs and their interactions with Canadians by Jordan Bailey at UWO.
Yeah, and I was remiss. I did not mention my colleague in the Department of History, Dr. Stephanie Vangarth, wrote a book on resistance to Japanese internment during the Second World War. That was published at the University of British Columbia Press, and I highly recommend that book as well by Dr. Vangarth.
And that is all for our questions.
I'm just, Katrina, I'm just looking down my sidebar. I see someone here has said, thank you for helping us, homeschool alumni. Today, I have an 11-year-old boy fully engaged. That's great. I'm glad to hear it. Send them the Kings in 7 years. Thank you very much, everyone. Once again, I wish I could have been there with you to see you all. I hope we will be able to do that before too long. And a reminder, once again at 1 p.m., Professor Francesco will be talking about our human rights studies. We don't know what's going to happen at King's in the next few months, but I want to assure you, everyone here is working full-time to make sure that we're going to have excellent program offerings this fall. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming today.